In the last episode, Toyotomi Hideyoshi launched his second invasion of the Korean peninsula, sending his samurai armies forth to fight in yet another hard campaign to seize territory on the mainland. Yet in his haste to prove his might on the world stage, his ailing health would finally catch up with him, as at long last, by September of 1598, he would die. Now we witness the build-up and aftermath of his passing, as the daimyo of Japan assess the future of the nation. By the end of the summer of 1598, the second great unifier of Japan, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, was on his deathbed. Suffering from old age and illness, a life of campaigns that had withered him away, his body had given out and his mind was fading. Not to mention the fact that the developments of his second invasion of Korea no doubt were still causing him incredible stress. Famously, he had asked his generals to not let his soldiers become ghosts in a foreign land. Yet that is exactly what he had just done. Perhaps due to his failing mental state, he was a constant ball of emotions. While it is said that he may have found the results of the second invasion satisfactory in regard to the damage his armies had inflicted on China and Korea, on the other hand, it was impossible to ignore that the invasion itself was a failure. One that would taint his legacy and family, no doubt for years to come. His very fears that he had initially set out to alleviate now had a very real possibility of coming to fruition, that being the downfall of his family and Japan collapsing back into war. For that he must have felt only grief and remorse. Realizing the war to be done, we saw in the previous episode how he began to order his generals and their armies to return to Japan. But as for the situation at home, Hideyoshi, fearing for what might come following his death, began calling daimyo to Fushimi Castle, where they were to swear new vows of loyalty to him, his family, and his son and heir, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a last-ditch desperate attempt to preserve his family's rule. However, Hideyoshi was still young, just a child of around 5 years of age. He would need great help and guidance following the death of his father. To this end, shortly after his birth back in 1593, Hideyoshi had went forth with plans to form a council of regents, who could watch over the boy until he came of age and would be able to properly assume his father's role atop the country. It was a measure of precaution that upon Hideyoshi's death, this council would not only look after his son, but also ensure that no other member of the council could grow too powerful. By 1595, the council was formally announced. Its members included some of the strongest and most influential daimyo in all of Japan: Maeda Toshie, Mori Terumoto, Ukita Hidei, Kobayakawa Takakage, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Yet it should be noted that by 1598, Uesugi Kagekatsu had been promoted to the council to replace Kobayakawa Takakage, who had passed away in 1597. This council of 5 regents would come to be known as Gotairo, and if you have been keeping up with this series, one of these names must appear more prominent than the others: Tokugawa Ieyasu. Why would Hideyoshi ever place his greatest rival and threat on such a powerful and prestigious council? You see, what it gets back to is the idea of ensuring balance. The councilors were to keep each other in check, as I mentioned, so that one does not grow too mighty and attempt to usurp power. But as things stood, Tokugawa Ieyasu was already the strongest figure on this council. Not only was he the lord of the Kanto region, making him extremely wealthy and well supplied, but also, we have previously seen he had skillfully kept his armies out of the war in Korea. While many had gone forth into the Imjin War, Ieyasu had stayed out, saving up his strength for his hour of destiny, a time which was soon to be upon him. As I have mentioned before, if Hideyoshi had proper foresight, perhaps he could have still somehow demanded the involvement of the Tokugawa to some degree in the invasions, either through manpower or supply. Because in the end, the war had come out to weaken at least 3 of the other council members who had lent their support, all while Ieyasu was immune. Hideyoshi's final days were spent drifting in and out of consciousness, as daimyo came forth to renew their vows to the Toyotomi clan. Efforts had been made to try and improve his condition, with one of the wildest tales being body parts from tigers in Korea being sent back to Japan, where Hideyoshi could use them for medicinal purposes, hopefully to regain some of his strength. Of course, this had no effect, and instead, by September, it was clear that his death was imminent. Knowing this, Hideyoshi sent out parting gifts of gold, silver, swords, and fine robes to his vassals, nobility he was friends with, and the emperor himself. Lastly, he composed a form of death poem to serve as a melancholy capstone to his extraordinary life story. It read simply, "My life came like dew, disappears like dew. All of Naniwa is dream after dream." On the 18th day of September in the year 1598, Toyotomi Hideyoshi died at Fushimi Castle at the age of 63. In the end, it has been said that his last thoughts were of his vassals and generals, those who had served him faithfully, those he was sad to part ways with. Although he inevitably would fail to secure a state of stability for the future of the Toyotomi family, the man himself, Hideyoshi, left behind one of the greatest legacies Japan would ever know. A commoner and foot soldier who through service became samurai, and from there through achievement elevated his position, succeeding his lord to eventually finish what his predecessor had started, the unification of Japan. Hideyoshi brought an initial end to the wars, a glimmer of what could have been the full end to the Sengoku period. His greatest failure among all of his accomplishments perhaps is simply the fact that he was not able to properly cement his regime, as his efforts to do so in Korea had failed, and thus his plan to see the security and stability for future generations of the Toyotomi family had also failed. What can be said about his time atop Japan is that he laid a solid framework of authority. Throughout his campaigns, his diplomatic skills had secured the loyalty of those who had been his enemies, and his influence spread far and wide across the land through his vassals and the mighty fortresses they occupied. Along with this, his Red Seal edicts were responsible for shaping the new structure of not only the samurai, but also society, bringing an end to commoners owning weapons and cutting off their ability to advance their social status. Hideyoshi made it so that all must live the life they were born into. Everything would have a place where it belonged. These and other efforts he made would lay the groundwork for the future of feudal Japan. Back in Korea, the Japanese armies were pulling out, while brave samurai commanders continued to hold their ground so that others could make their escape. In Ulsan, Kato Kiyomasa held firm against waves of Chinese and Korean forces. At Suncheon, Konishi Yukinaga weathered a brutal allied bombardment and siege, but refused to break. And at Sachon, Shimazu Yoshihiro endured a brutal siege and relied heavily on explosives to blow up the attacking Chinese and Korean soldiers, resulting in massive casualties. Shimazu Yoshihiro is often one of the unsung heroes of the Imjin War, claiming a number of impressive victories and lending much of his forces from Satsuma into the conflict. His son Taratsune also saw extensive service during the war, and it is suggested that at some point during the conflict, Taratsune may have fought alongside a certain samurai who had distinguished himself in Korea as a ferocious and valiant warrior. This man was a samurai from Shinano province, one who had for the last decade been faithfully in the service of the Toyotomi clan. This was Sanada Nobushige, known commonly today as Sanada Yukimura. Taratsune is famously said to have been taken aback by the skill and bravery of Yukimura and would years later refer to him simply as the #1 warrior in Japan. And as we will come to see, the story of Yukimura will come to play a massive role in the conclusion of the period. Eventually, it was time for the final Japanese armies to make their withdrawal back to Japan, with many boarding ships under the cover of night. The last major battle of the war would occur at Noryang Point, a final sea battle that saw Japanese naval forces engaging the blockading Korean and Chinese fleet. Konishi Yukinaga and Shimazu Yoshihiro would be two of the main Japanese commanders during this clash, and would have to contend with that of the famous Korean Admiral Yi Sun-shin. It would end like most other naval battles of the war, another victory for the Korean and Chinese allied forces, inflicting massive casualties and damage upon the Japanese Navy. Noryang would be a more celebrated triumph were it not for the fact that during the course of the struggle, Yi Sun-shin was hit by a stray bullet, which resulted in his death. Yi Sun-shin would die a hero and is continually remembered as one of the greatest Korean commanders, and more importantly, one of the greatest admirals the world has ever known. Following the battle, the surviving Japanese ships and commanders retreated to Busan, where they eventually were to make a full withdrawal back to Japan shortly thereafter. With the last Japanese soldiers leaving Korea, the war was over. Over the next several years, Japanese diplomats would continue to try and fix their relations with Korea and China, but it would be some time before anything returned to some sense of normalcy. Many of the commanders who had fought so hard in the war, in Hideyoshi's name and for his cause, came home to a Japan without their great leader. In his place, there was now only uncertainty. The Council of Five Regents was no replacement for Hideyoshi himself, and with Hideyori still a child, there was no central figure to steer the government in a solid direction. What was certain, however, was that those who had fought and returned home were now in an uneasy position, not only weakened by their efforts in the war, but also suffering from a form of identity crisis, having given their all to a man whose ambitions were never realistically achievable. Some were outright dissatisfied, while others remained resolute in their faith to the Toyotomi name. All of these raw feelings would soon become some of the driving factors behind the division to come, because, as we will soon see, the very fears Hideyoshi had tried to prevent would rise up. With his death, a path to leadership was beginning to form, for none other than Tokugawa Ieyasu. So, what can we learn? By the fall of 1598, the second great unifier of Japan, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, died. Initially, fearing his passing, he had formed a council of regents to govern in his stead and watch over his young son and heir, Hideyori. But this governing body immediately is seen to have an unequal balance, as those who had fought in the war and were loyal to Hideyoshi were not as powerful as Tokugawa Ieyasu, who now had become the mightiest daimyo in the land. With Hideyoshi's death also came the closing of the war in Korea, as the remaining Japanese forces desperately made their final withdrawal back home to Japan, effectively ending the conflict. In the next episode, the division starts to deepen as Tokugawa Ieyasu begins making moves to assert himself and his influence over the nation following the death of Hideyoshi. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.